The Netflix series shows him as the Godfather of Harlem, untouchable, all-powerful. A man who controlled every street, every business, every decision in a neighborhood of 200,000 people. The movies paint him as a legend who walked through Harlem like a king, solving problems with a word, commanding absolute loyalty, feared and respected by everyone from street hustlers to city politicians. But what do the actual FBI files say? What do police records show? What do the people who lived through that era remember when you strip away the mythology? The truth is more complicated, more interesting, and in some ways more impressive than the Hollywood version. This is the story of what Bumpy Johnson really controlled, what he didn't control, and why the reality might be more remarkable than the myth. Let me start with what the FBI files definitively show, because the FBI watched Bumpy Johnson for over 30 years. They have hundreds of pages of surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, informant statements, and investigative summaries, and those files paint a very specific picture. FBI file number 926054, opened in 1952. Subject: Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The file describes him as a significant organized crime figure operating primarily in the Harlem area of Manhattan, involved in illegal gambling operations, specifically the numbers racket, and suspected of involvement in narcotics distribution, though direct evidence remains elusive. Notice what's not there. The FBI doesn't call him the boss of Harlem or the controller of all organized crime in Harlem. They call him a significant figure, one of several. A 1957 surveillance report is even more specific. Subject Johnson operates an estimated 15-20 policy banks in Central and East Harlem, employing approximately 200 from 300 individuals as runners, collectors, and enforcers. Financial analysis suggests gross annual income between $500 US dollars and $750 US dollars, with net profit estimated at $150 US dollars, $200 US dollars after payoffs to police, politicians, and operating expenses. Let's break that down. 15 to 20 policy banks, in a neighborhood that had over 100 policy banks operating at any given time. Bumpy controlled somewhere between 15 and 20% of Harlem's numbers operation. Significant? Absolutely. Total control? Not even close. The FBI file also lists his competitors. Names most people have never heard. Jose Battle, who ran numbers in East Harlem and Spanish Harlem. Nat Pettigrew, who controlled several blocks in Central Harlem. Leroy Nicky Barnes, who emerged in the 1960s. Raymond Spanish Raymond Marquez. Dozens of other operators, some small-time, some substantial. Bumpy was the most famous, the most respected, the most feared. But he wasn't the only player. He wasn't even necessarily the biggest player by pure financial metrics. So where does the myth of total control come from? Partly from Bumpy himself. He cultivated that image, understood that perceived power is almost as useful as actual power. If people believe you control everything, they act like you control everything. They come to you to solve disputes. They seek your approval for operations. They pay you respect and tribute, not because you can actually shut them down, but because they think you can. Partly from Hollywood. Movies and TV shows need simple narratives. A protagonist whose the definitive power makes for better drama than one of several significant figures in a complex criminal ecosystem. And partly from selective memory. The people who talk about Bumpy decades later, they remember the dramatic moments, the confrontations, the times he wielded power spectacularly. They don't remember the mundane reality of day-to-day operations, the limits of his reach, the times he couldn't solve a problem or prevent something from happening. But here's what makes the reality more interesting than the myth. Bumpy didn't need to control everything. What he controlled was something more valuable than territory or money. He controlled reputation. Let me show you what I mean with a specific example from FBI surveillance reports. August 1963. Bumpy had just been released from Alcatraz. He'd been gone for 11 years. Logic suggests his empire would have crumbled, his influence vanished, his territory carved up by competitors. The FBI report from September 1963 describes what actually happened. Within 3 weeks of Johnson's return to Harlem, multiple policy bank operators who had been operating independently during his incarceration approached him seeking to establish working relationships. Johnson appears to have re-established significant influence not through violence or intimidation, but through negotiation and reputation. Translation: people voluntarily came to Bumpy. They wanted his blessing, not because he could force them, but because association with him provided legitimacy and protection. The FBI noted something else. Johnson's return coincided with a marked decrease in violent incidents related to numbers operations. Disputes that previously resulted in shootings or beatings were being mediated through Johnson's intervention. Bumpy's real power wasn't controlling every operation. It was being the person other operators trusted to settle disputes fairly, to set rules everyone would follow, to maintain peace that allowed everyone to profit. That's not Hollywood control. That's something more sophisticated. That's being a judge, not a king. But let's not romanticize. The FBI files also document violence, beatings ordered, people disappearing, enforcers delivering messages in blood. Bumpy Johnson was not a pacifist. He used violence when he deemed it necessary. A 1965 report details an incident where a policy banker tried to expand into what Bumpy considered protected territory. 3 individuals associated with the rival operation were hospitalized with severe injuries. No arrests were made as victims refused to cooperate with police. Informant reports suggest Johnson ordered the assault as a warning. So he absolutely used force. But the FBI files suggest he used it strategically, not indiscriminately. Violence as punctuation, not conversation. Now let's talk about what Bumpy definitely didn't control, despite what Hollywood suggests. Narcotics. The FBI spent years trying to connect Bumpy to heroin distribution. They never could. Multiple informants stated that Bumpy refused to become involved in narcotic sales, considering it destructive to the community. Was that morality or business calculation? Probably both. Heroin brought federal heat. It destroyed the community that was his power base. It was bad for long-term business. The FBI file notes, while Johnson associates with known narcotics traffickers and likely receives financial benefits from such associations, direct evidence of his involvement in distribution or importation remains lacking. Translation: he knew drug dealers, probably took a cut from some, but he wasn't running the drug trade. Politics. Hollywood shows Bumpy controlling politicians, having city council members in his pocket. The FBI files paint a different picture. Johnson maintains relationships with several local politicians, primarily through campaign contributions and voter mobilization in Harlem districts. However, his influence appears limited to local matters. Attempts to influence judicial appointments or major policy decisions have been unsuccessful. He had local councilmen who owed him favors, maybe a few judges who'd look the other way on minor charges. But controlling New York politics? No evidence of that. The police. This one's complicated. FBI files document extensive NYPD corruption in Harlem during Bumpy's era, hundreds of officers taking bribes from numbers operators, including Bumpy. But the files also show the limits of that corruption. While Johnson has successfully bribed numerous patrol officers and several precinct commanders, major operations against his activities proceed when ordered by higher NYPD leadership or when federal agencies become involved. He could buy protection from street-level harassment. He couldn't prevent serious investigations. In 1951, when the Kefauver Committee investigated organized crime, Bumpy was subpoenaed. His police connections couldn't stop that. In 1952, when he was arrested for conspiracy, his political connections couldn't prevent prosecution. In 1963, when he went to Alcatraz, nobody could get him out early. So what's the accurate picture? What did Bumpy actually control? Based on FBI files, police records, and oral histories, here's what we can say with confidence. Bumpy Johnson controlled approximately 15-20 policy banks in Central and East Harlem. Not all of them, not even most of them, but a significant number. He controlled the respect of other criminals in Harlem, not through fear alone, but through demonstrated fairness, intelligence, and willingness to use violence when necessary. He controlled his reputation. Through careful cultivation, strategic actions, and genuine community engagement, he created an image of power that exceeded his actual financial or territorial control. He controlled certain relationships, with Italian mobsters who respected him as an equal, with local politicians who valued his ability to deliver votes, with police officers willing to look the other way for a price. What he didn't control: the entirety of Harlem's criminal economy, narcotics distribution, city politics, the NYPD as an institution, his own fate when federal authorities decided to prosecute. But here's what makes the reality more impressive than the myth. Bumpy Johnson operated in an era of virulent racism. Police brutality against black citizens was routine. Black gangsters were typically treated as expendable by Italian and Jewish mobsters who dominated organized crime. In that context, Bumpy carved out autonomy. He built an operation that couldn't be easily dismantled. He earned respect from people who typically refused to respect black men. He protected his community from worse exploitation, while, yes, still exploiting it himself through illegal gambling. He was a criminal. Let's not lose sight of that. The numbers racket took money from poor people desperate for hope. His enforcement created victims. His world was built on illegal activity that harmed people, but within that criminal world, he was exceptional. Not because he controlled everything, he didn't, but because he controlled enough and did it with enough intelligence and strategic thinking that he became legendary. The FBI file concludes with this assessment, written in 1968, shortly before his death. Subject Johnson, despite advanced age and health problems, continues to maintain significant influence in Harlem organized crime circles. His value to criminal operations appears to be less about direct control and more about his role as mediator, advisor, and symbolic figure. Other operators seek his approval, not because they must, but because they perceive value in doing so. That's the real Bumpy Johnson, not the all-powerful king of Hollywood, but something arguably more impressive. A strategist who understood that real power comes not from controlling everything, but from being indispensable to the people who do. So, did Bumpy Johnson really control Harlem? No, not in the way Hollywood depicts. Did he have significant power and influence that shaped Harlem's criminal landscape for decades? Absolutely. Was he a legend, whose intelligence and strategic thinking made him exceptional in his world? Yes. Was he a hero? No. He was a criminal who profited from his community's desperation. Was he a one-dimensional villain? Also no. He was a complex man who operated within brutal constraints and created something remarkable despite impossible odds. The truth is messy. It's complicated. It doesn't fit neatly into a movie narrative, but it's more interesting than any Hollywood script. Because the real Bumpy Johnson didn't need to control everything to matter. He just needed to be smart enough, tough enough, and strategic enough to carve out space in a world that wanted to deny him any power at all. And that, documented in hundreds of pages of FBI surveillance, police reports, and oral histories, is what actually happened. If this investigation into myth versus reality moved you, subscribe for more deep dives into the true history of Harlem's most legendary figures. Drop a like if you appreciate complexity over simplification. What surprised you most about the real Bumpy Johnson? Let me know in the comments below.